Hi everyone, Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is on Congress and the presidency. Congress, or the legislative branch of the federal government, and the presidency, or the executive branch of the federal government, are fundamental parts, obviously, of the United States Constitution. Congress and the presidency, along with, of course, the Supreme Court, are designed to interact and check one another. The branches of the United States government um, are separate and they balance each other, right, through differing powers. And at the founding of the country, there's no question that Congress, the legislative branch, was considered the most important. For many of the Enlightenment thinkers that created the ideas that countries like the United States were based upon, thinkers like John Locke, for example, legislatures were the most fundamental level of government and the most important level of government because the idea was that it could be more moderate and balance out the potential abuse of a single leader. So in the United States, the presidency was actually initially designed to be somewhat weaker than the Congress. In fact, the first government of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, which was the law of the land in the United States during the 1780s, the Articles of Confederation didn't even have a president. There was a leader of the legislature, but there was no presidency. There was no president. There was no executive branch, and that was deemed a problem in some cases. But the Constitution designed a three-tiered government, really, with the presidency, with Congress, and of course with the judicial branch. But the presidency was added, and it was still not considered the most integral branch. The most integral branch in the country was certainly the legislative branch, the Congress. Congress today is made up generally of lawyers and mainly college grads, about 75% college grads, 50% lawyers. Of course, you see here the Capitol building with the rotunda underneath the dome in the middle. It was intended to be the most powerful branch of government, as I mentioned. And interestingly, since the beginning of the 20th century, most scholars accept that the power of Congress has actually waned amid the rising power of the executive branch. That over the course of the past 120 years or so, the executive branch has increasingly grown in power, while the power of the legislature has waned somewhat. The House of Representatives, at the founding of the country, the House of Representatives was the only portion of the government that was directly elected. The Senate was chosen by the states, and the president was, of course, selected through the Electoral College, as is still the case. Today, after the 12th Amendment, the Senate, we do have direct election of senators, but initially at the founding of the country, the only body in the land that was directly elected was the House of Representatives. Part of the compromise in the creation of the U.S. Constitution had to do with representation. There had to be a system in which the big states felt like they got a fair shake, but the small states felt like they got a fair shake. And so as a result of that, we have a bicameral government, meaning two houses. The lower house, the House of Representatives, is based on its members are based on population. So the larger your population, the more representatives your state has, and that was meant during the constitutional compromises. That was meant to fulfill the demands of larger states who would have greater representation. Likewise, the Senate, they organized as having equal representation. Many of the small states generally said they wanted an equal representative system so that they would not be disadvantaged for having a lower population. And so the Senate, every state has 2 senators. And so today we have 435 members of the House, and we have 100 members of the Senate, 2 from each state. Senators tend to have a broader constituency. The constituency refers to the citizens that they represent, whereas House members are represented by a smaller kind of block of constituencies, and therefore are less broad, I suppose, in their decision making, if that makes sense, than a member of the Senate who represents basically half of an entire state. The House, we have elections every 2 years. The Senate, of course, we have elections every 6 years. And the Senate is the upper house, and the founders of the nation designed the Senate to theoretically be somewhat more powerful than the House, as the Senate would be the more broadly representative body, and the House, you would be the direct, sort of democratically elected body that would be larger, but would also have shorter durations for people's terms, and somewhat less power than the Senate. The capital, located in the nation's capital, meaning the capital is in the location, Washington, D.C., was not established actually until 1800, and it was not until the presidency of Thomas Jefferson that we actually had a president who served in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was a swamp, foggy bottom, and it was a city that was designed. It was a city that was designed from blueprints, and actually George Washington helped in the surveying for the nation's capital. Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, is located very, very close to the Potomac River on the Virginia side of Washington, D.C. Of course, Washington, D.C. is not a part of a state. It is the District of Columbia, and there's about 600,000 citizens that live in Washington, D.C., but it is neither part of Maryland, it is neither part of Virginia. The location of Washington, D.C., and of course the Capitol building, the location was part of a compromise during the formation of the U.S. Constitution, or the processes in the ratification process. And this compromise was that southern states were concerned. Southern states had a lower population, and they were concerned that the northern areas would begin to exert dominance over the South ultimately. And so a compromise was made to ultimately place the District of Columbia between Maryland and Virginia, and therefore having a capital that was more centered at least towards the South. These measures in the early founding of the country were very important because there was actually already a developing divide politically between the North and the South, and various tensions over political power between the more populous North and the less populous South. And actually the capital, before Washington, D.C. was established, the capital moved around quite a bit, and the capital was really only located, the capital was where the legislature was. And so we had a capital in Philadelphia, and we had the capital in New York City. And presidents like George Washington never actually served in Washington, D.C. When you look at the Capitol building, the House is located in the southern building. So if you see the two wings, each of those wings is an area for the House and the Senate. And the picture above is the House, and this is George W. Bush giving his State of the Union address in the House of Representatives. And so that's the inside the chamber of the House of Representatives. The House building is located in the south, the Senate side is in the north, and of course the rotunda is in the middle. When you have a State of the Union address, which by the way is also not something that presidents always gave. Thomas Jefferson never gave a State of the Union address. He never publicly, he preferred not to speak, and so therefore Jefferson did not give live State of the Union addresses. So it's only, over time it became a practice. But even though the president has a responsibility to oversee the State of the Union and to inform the Congress, giving a speech that was sort of like, we think, big news, was not always done, and some presidents again did not give a big speech on the State of the Union. Thomas Jefferson used to write out his thoughts. Congress has, in a lot of ways, is designed to be the most powerful of the branches. Congress has the power of the purse, and that means the rights over financial things. And this could be tax policy, import duties, and also, of course, the power to declare war. The declaration of war, the power to declare war, was designed to prevent a president from going to war on his own designs, rather than having the nation make a rational decision about when and where not to have a war. Interestingly, in the last 60, 70 years, the war declaration, the power to declare war by Congress, is generally never used. It's become a power of Congress that was designed to be incredibly significant, but it's virtually never used. And your immediate thought with that might be, like, wait a second, I thought we were fighting wars, it seems like, all the time. And that's true, but instead of declarations of war, Congress has recently reverted to loose resolutions at the request of a commander-in-chief. Loose resolutions that allow the presidency to wage war more or less as it sees fit, given a particular situation. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan that is effectively still going on. These were wars that were begun on the basis of resolutions. The Vietnam War was an undeclared war. So recently, in the last 60 or 70 years, really since World War II, the declaration of war is a power of Congress that is virtually never used. Bicameralism refers to just simply the fact that we have two houses, the Senate and the upper house of the Senate, the lower house of representatives, that these two houses work together. And anytime you have a bill that goes through, it has to pass the House and it has to pass the Senate. And as the bill passes the House, the Senate can take the bill and change the bill. And if the Senate changes the bill, they can send it back to the House. Ultimately, the two must adopt bills that agree. And so in the lawmaking process, both of these bodies must work together. Congress has the power to make laws that are necessary for the orderly process of governing the nation. And that is something that can be interpreted rather widely. Now, of course, if Congress were to pass a law that might violate the Constitution, of course, the Supreme Court has the right to hear the case and determine whether or not the law is in fact constitutional. The House also has the power, the House of Representatives also has the power to impeach a president for high crimes and misdemeanor. And of course, we've had President Andrew Johnson was the closest president to come to being removed by impeachment. Nixon, of course, resigned. Andrew Johnson was the president after Abraham Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson was, in fact, impeached, and he came one vote away from being removed from office, far closer than any other president. It's a commonly held myth that Bill Clinton came closer than anyone to being removed from office. That's actually not true. Andrew Johnson came much closer, and in reality, Richard Nixon came much closer as well, because Richard Nixon, had he not resigned, would have almost certainly been removed by impeachment. The head of the House is the Speaker of the House, and here you see pictured Henry Clay, who was a representative from Kentucky, and Speaker of the House intermittently between 1813 and 1825. He was not the Speaker continuously for that period, but he was from Kentucky, and he was one of the great sort of second generation of founding figures in the American Republic. Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House is in the line for the presidency should the president and the vice president be killed. The Speaker of the House is in line for that. The Speaker of the House heads the House of Representatives, and as a result, wields a significant amount of power when it comes to what will be voted on, when it will be voted on, what bills will be taken before the body, and so forth. By comparison, the Senate has a number of very unique and important powers as well. The Senate has the power to approve presidential nominees. The president has the power to appoint Supreme Court justices. It has a power to appoint important figures within the federal apparatus. And only the Senate has the power to approve or disapprove of this. The Supreme Court, justices like Justice Alito, Justice John Roberts, and so forth, are some of the Supreme Court justices who have been approved by the Senate. The Senate is also designed to have a sway in foreign policy. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee is one of the most important branches when it comes to diplomacy and foreign relations in the United States. And the Senate has the power to, with the executive, have a say in treaties and diplomacy. The presidency, and of course we have pictured here President George Washington, has really had an expansion of its powers in recent years. The presidency, some of its basic powers, of course, are the power to create a cabinet. George Washington was the first president to create a cabinet. And the cabinet refers to the president's primary advisors, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the Vice President, for example, are all members of the president's cabinet. Today, the president forms not only a cabinet, but a National Security Council as part of that. And together, this body of advisors help guide the executive branch's decisions on foreign policy. The president is the commander-in-chief, and the president is also the diplomat-in-chief. And so the president has a unique power when it comes to ordering troops to battle in the defense of national security, and also in forming treaties with nations, as we've recently seen with the Iran nuclear deal. The president has one of their most central powers of the president is in foreign policy, in the area of making treaties, in the area of leading armies into battle. The president has a right and a responsibility to see that laws are carried out properly. And so the commander-in-chief, in the case of a national emergency, has the power to lead the American military into battle, whether on home soil or abroad. And actually, George Washington, pictured here, is a very fitting individual to talk about in this respect, because George Washington is technically the only president to ever lead his army to the field of battle. And he did this during the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s. George Washington, there was no real rebellion, there was no shooting, nobody was killed in the Whiskey Rebellion, and so there wasn't any formal battles. But the Whiskey Rebellion was a case in which individuals in western Pennsylvania who were distilling whiskey did not want to pay the tax on whiskey that the Washington administration had raised. And so Washington, having the duty to see through the laws of the land, Washington organized an army of militiamen, and he mounted his famed horse Nelson and led the soldiers towards western Pennsylvania, where he planned to crush the rebellion. And of course, when the rebellious moonshiners, if you will, saw that this would be a real battle, they of course gave in and ultimately accepted the whiskey tax. But the president has the power to lead troops into battle. The president can't declare a war, only Congress can declare a war. And today, Congress tends, as I said, to use a loose resolution offered by the president to allow the president to make war. But once war is declared or that resolution is passed, or if it's an emergency situation, the president has the ability to make national security policy and make war policy. The president has the ability to oversee the conduct of these types of affairs. The president, having the responsibility of overseeing the implementation of laws, the president also has excuse me, I'm sorry. The president also has the power to or the responsibility to consult and address Congress. which of course happens most famously during the State of the Union, which happens once a year. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the practice of actually giving an address in the State of the Union address is not something that all presidents practiced. As I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson being an exception to that rule. During a time of war, the president has much greater power, and this has been seen in the 20th century, where we've had really an expansion of presidential authority, particularly in a time of war. Um, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964, allowed for the Vietnam War, which became a war in which the United States dropped more tons of bombs in Vietnam than all theaters of World War II combined. The Vietnam War had 550,000 combat troops in Vietnam at one point, in Southeast Asia at one point. And that was based on a loose resolution from Congress that authorized the president the ability to use military forces in the defense of national security as he saw fit. More recently, of course, the resolutions to take the United States into war in Afghanistan and in Iraq are examples of Congress granting greater power to the president in a time of war, and also, of course, the USA Patriot Act, which the presidency of George W. Bush was able to pass, and which has more or less remained intact, and authorized, without consent of Congress, authorized massive spying of the American people and surveillance of the American people with the NSA, of course, and which very much expanded the power of the president to take unprecedented actions in the interest of national security, not only abroad and not only with potential terrorists, but broadly in terms of domestic sense, in terms of surveilling the American people. The United States has spent a lot of time in war in the last 70 years, and it is perhaps this reason that the power of the presidency has to some degree expanded in the last 70 years, whereas the power of Congress to regulate the presidency has waned somewhat. Okay, guys. Well, this went on a little while, so I hope this is helpful. Thanks, guys.